A mountain man placed a notice asking for help with cooking and housework. A pregnant widow answered it. When he asked her name, she gave it. He dropped his mug. His face drained. The name haunted him. The trail was already hard by the time the sun cracked over the tree-tipped ridges and the woman's boots were soaked through. There was a tremble in her step, but she never paused. A cold mist was moving off the valley, and her coat, worn thin around the seams, hung heavy from yesterday's rain. Still, she walked. One arm held tightly across her rounded belly. The other clutched a battered satchel. Miriam didn't look back at the town she'd left behind. It had taken everything in her not to turn around when the conductor gave her that sideways glance as she stepped off the coach. She knew how folks talked, especially when a woman was carrying and had no man beside her. But she had no room for shame anymore. Pride was something she'd buried in the same graveyard as her husband. Ahead, the mountain loomed like a stone wall against the gray sky. Somewhere up there was the cabin. The notice had been clear: help wanted, preferably a woman to cook, clean, and keep a quiet house. Room and board included. No questions asked. It sounded too simple. That's what made her heart race as she followed the overgrown trail with nothing but silence around her. That and the flutter in her womb every time her boots skidded on loose gravel. The baby inside her kicked again, gently this time. It always seemed to stir when she was afraid. A branch cracked to her left and she froze. The woods were full of noises: a fox, a deer, maybe a bear. But after a long moment, only the wind replied. She moved again. The cabin came into view just past a ridge, nestled between tall pines. It was larger than she expected. Logs stacked high, windows patched with worn but clean panes, smoke curling steady from a stone chimney. There was no fence, no dog barking to announce her presence, just an axe wedged deep into a stump and a wagon leaning crooked near the shed. She stepped forward and raised a hand to knock. But the door opened first. He filled the frame like a shadow, tall, bearded flannel shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled. His hands were calloused and still damp, likely from chopping or hauling water. His eyes, though, were clear and alert, not unkind but sharp. "You the one from the posting?" His voice was deep and gravelly, like it hadn't been used much lately. "Yes," Miriam said, breath catching. "I saw the flyer in town. Her voice faltered as she tried to straighten up. "My name's Miriam." He stared at her. For a moment the only sound between them was the wind pushing through the trees. His jaw clenched. Then his eyes flicked downward, at the round swell of her belly, the scuffed boots, the satchel barely holding together. "You're pregnant," he said plainly. "Yes," she replied. He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar smoke and stew. It wasn't dirty, but it wasn't tidy either. Dishes sat rinsed but unstacked. There were traps near the door, and a rifle leaned against the hearth. She noticed the bed was made, tightly tucked, though there was only one. He offered her a chair and poured water into a tin cup from a kettle warming on the stove. "Long trip?" "Yes," she said, wrapping cold hands around the cup. "But I didn't expect easy." He nodded once. "You'll cook and clean. I work dawn till dusk. Won't be in your way much. There's a spare room off the back, not much bigger than a closet. It's yours." "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment. Then, as he turned back to the pot simmering over the flames, she added, "What's your name?" He paused with the spoon halfway to his mouth. "Jonah." She waited for more, but that was all he gave. The next morning she was up before the rooster, though there was no rooster, just the sound of pine needles brushing against the walls. She rolled from the bed, wincing at the stiffness in her hips, and shuffled into the kitchen. There was flour, lard, a sack of oats, dried beans, and a slab of salted pork hanging near the rafters. She cooked and he ate, said nothing but left his plate clean. When he disappeared into the woods with his traps, she cleaned, swept, patched a tear in his coat she'd found by the fire. By nightfall, she was too tired to eat much herself, but she kept doing it, day after day. The routine formed like a rhythm: wake, cook, clean, stitch, rest. He'd return with a catch or firewood, sometimes both. He never asked questions, never looked at her too long, but he always left his plate empty and returned the water bucket full. And then one night, just as the first real snow flurried across the sky, she dropped her needle mid-stitch and gasped. The baby had shifted, low and strong. She gripped the table and braced herself. Jonah, sitting nearby whittling, stood in an instant. "You all right?" "I think it's coming," she whispered. He set down the wood and stepped forward. "Now." She nodded. Panic rippled across his face for the first time. He moved fast after that, blankets boiled in water, a basin readied, towels stacked. She didn't ask how he knew what to do. Maybe he didn't. Maybe instinct took over, but his hands were steady. His voice stayed calm. It was a long night. And then just before sunrise, the cabin filled with a cry. A girl, tiny, squirming, wrapped in a flannel shirt. Jonah held her, breathless. "What's her name?" he asked softly. Miriam, pale and trembling, looked up at him and smiled through tears. "Grace." He stared at the child, and something in his face cracked. He knelt slowly and placed the baby in her arms, then stepped away like something burned him. She watched him retreat toward the fire, his back turned. She didn't press him. Not then. But 3 nights later, while snow dusted the windows and the wind howled through the trees, she heard him crying. Quiet, like he didn't want her to notice, but she did. And she remembered that first day, how he dropped the mug when she said her name. Miriam. He had known someone by that name once, she could tell. But what he hadn't told her, what still waited behind the silence, was why that name had broken him. And what it meant for the girl now lying in her arms. Jonah didn't speak much the next morning. He kept his head down as he chopped wood and hauled water, only glancing inside the cabin to check the fire or refill the kettle. Miriam didn't press him. Grace lay bundled in a quilt near the hearth, her tiny fists twitching in her sleep, her little face scrunching every now and then as if dreaming of something bright and far away. Miriam watched the mountain man move about his work with mechanical precision, but something had shifted. It was in the way he lingered by the door, the way his hands slowed when he passed Grace, the way he paused before setting the kettle down like he was wrestling with something unseen. There was grief in his silence, heavy and coiled, like a rope that had been wound too tight for too long. That night she tried to break it. "You've been kind," she said softly, as he stood near the window watching snow drift over the ridge. "You didn't have to be." He said nothing at first, then slowly, "Didn't seem right to let you birth her alone. But you've done more than that." She smiled faintly, rocking Grace in her arms. "You've made us feel safe." He looked at her for a long moment, then so low she almost didn't hear him. "No one made her safe." Miriam tilted her head. "Who?" He looked away, his jaw tightened. "Her name was Miriam too," he said finally. She was someone I should have protected, someone I failed." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with pain, with memory, with something so broken it barely had words left to describe it. "I'm not her," Miriam said gently. He nodded, but the truth sat between them like a ghost. The name had opened a wound, and the child had poured salt in it. Still the days passed. The snow grew deeper. Jonah taught Miriam how to stoke the fire properly, how to split kindling, how to patch gaps in the window seams. He brought her stronger boots from the shed, lined with rabbit fur. They were hers, he said simply. You'll need 'em. Miriam accepted them, without asking which her he meant. Sometimes at night, when Grace stirred and whimpered, Jonah would beat Miriam to her side. He'd rock the infant with surprising gentleness, his big hands careful not to startle her. Grace never cried for long when he held her. "You have children?" Miriam asked once cautiously. He stared into the fire. "I had a sister," he said. "She was all I had left after our parents died." Miriam waited. "She was 16 when I went west to stake a claim," he continued. "I sent money back, not much but enough. I thought I'd send for her soon." He exhaled, eyes dim. "By the time I got a letter again, it was from a sheriff. Said she disappeared. No one looked too hard. She was poor, a girl, not worth much to most." Miriam's breath caught. What was her name? He hesitated. Miriam. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The quiet that followed was heavier than before. A kind of understanding passed between them. This cabin, this job, this coincidence, it was no accident. Somehow the name had brought him full circle, and Grace, with her soft whimpers and clenched fists, was unearthing something he'd buried a long time ago. Weeks passed. The snow made it impossible to reach town, but Jonah had stored enough food, enough wood. They made do. Miriam recovered from the birth slowly, each day stronger than the last. Grace began to smile, a gummy, crooked grin that lit the room like a candle. Jonah built her a cradle from pine logs, carving tiny flowers into the corners. "She likes you," Miriam whispered one evening, watching Grace's eyes follow him as he moved. "She don't know me yet," he replied, but he didn't sound sure. Winter pressed on. The cold was cruel, but inside the cabin something began to thaw. Jonah laughed once, just once, when Grace sneezed and startled herself. Miriam smiled more. Her cheeks had color again. The three of them formed a rhythm, one so quiet and steady it might have gone unnoticed by anyone looking in from the outside. Then the knock came. It was late, well past dusk. Jonah had just set down his tools. Miriam was wrapping Grace in a fresh blanket when the knock echoed again, sharp and unfamiliar. Jonah moved fast. He grabbed the rifle from beside the door but didn't raise it, just held it low as he opened the door a crack. A man stood on the porch, wrapped in a wool coat, hat low over his brow, boots crusted with frost. His face was long and weathered, and his voice was too smooth. "Name S. Colton Price," he said. "Lookin' for a woman, pregnant, name's Miriam." Jonah didn't move. "Why?" Colton smirked. "She ran from Dakota Territory, thought she'd disappear, but she owes me, and I don't let debts walk off." Jonah opened the door a little wider, stepping into the threshold. "There's no woman like that here." "Oh," Colton cocked his head. "Then what's that crying I hear?" From inside, Grace let out a soft wail. Jonah's fingers tightened on the stock. Colton's eyes narrowed. "I got paperwork says she's mine, my wife before she skipped, that child too by law." Behind Jonah, Miriam stepped forward, holding Grace close. Her face was pale. "I'm not your wife," she said, voice trembling. "You forged that paper, you beat me. You left me near dead. I fled because the sheriff wouldn't listen." Colton smiled. "Ain't no law up here, sweetheart." Jonah stepped between them. "You need to leave." I ain't leaving without her." Jonah didn't raise the rifle. He didn't have to. The way he stood, the way his voice dropped low and steady, it was enough. Colton hesitated. "You think you can keep me from what's mine?" he spat. "I think you got two options," Jonah said. "Walk away, or I bury you out back where the snow's soft." Colton glared at him. Then slowly he backed down the steps, boots crunching over the crusted snow. "Ain't the end of this," he said, voice laced with venom. "I'll be back." Jonah didn't speak. He waited until Colton disappeared down the path, then shut the door and bolted it. Miriam sank into the chair, shaking. "Why would he do this?" she whispered. "He never wanted us. He tried to," she broke off. Jonah knelt beside her. "Because you survived him," he said, "and men like that can't stand it." She looked into his eyes and for the first time since she'd arrived saw something fierce there. Not anger, not hate, but purpose. "I won't let him take you," he said. Miriam clutched Grace tighter. "He'll come back." Jonah nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the wind howled louder, as if warning them of the storm yet to come. But inside the cabin, the fire blazed brighter than it had in weeks. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But neither of them would face it alone. The next morning brought silence. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace but instead hovers like a warning, a breath held too long. The tracks in the snow leading away from the cabin had already begun to fill, but Jonah followed them anyway, eyes scanning the woods, every muscle drawn tight. He didn't expect Colton to be far. Men like him didn't bluff and didn't forget, especially not when their pride had been bruised. He returned by noon with no sign of the man, just a tension that hadn't eased. Miriam met him at the door, Grace bundled in a sling around her chest. The baby had started to coo and smile, reaching for Jonah's beard whenever he got close enough. Sometimes she'd babble and mimic the shape of his mouth, and he'd watch her like she was a new language he was trying to learn. "We need to talk," Miriam said, not bothering with pleasantries. He nodded and set his rifle against the wall. She took a deep breath. "He'll be back. He doesn't stop until he's taken everything." Jonah sat slowly in the chair by the fire, leaning forward, hands clasped. "Then we end it," he said simply. Miriam shook her head, "Not with more blood." "He nearly killed you." "I know." Her eyes were steady now. "And if I don't do something, he'll come after us again. He doesn't care about Grace. It's control he wants." Jonah watched her, then looked at the baby now asleep against her chest. He nodded once. "Then we get you safe, both of you." That night they began packing quietly. Jonah pulled out a small map, yellowed at the corners. There was a trail east that no one used anymore, a path through the pines and across a frozen creek that would lead to an abandoned telegraph station. "There's a man there," Jonah explained. "Old friend. If the wires still work, he can get a message to a marshal I trust. And if Colton finds us first." Jonah's jaw set. "He won't." But he did. They left before dawn. The air was biting, the sky still dark, with only the first hints of light bleeding through the trees. Jonah led the way, axe at his hip, rifle slung across his shoulder, every sense alert. Miriam followed close, Grace warm against her chest, wrapped in every blanket they could spare. They made it 2 miles before the first shot rang out. It cracked through the trees like a whip, and Jonah spun, dropping to one knee, eyes scanning. Another shot. Snow kicked up a few feet from where they stood. "Down," he barked. Miriam dropped behind a fallen log, shielding Grace. Jonah moved fast, circling wide through the trees, silent as a shadow. He spotted the glint of metal first, Then the shape. Colton crouched behind a rock ledge, rifle in hand. Jonah didn't hesitate. He circled closer, heart pounding. But as he raised his own weapon, a sound stopped him, a cry, Grace, sharp and sudden. Colton heard it too. Sweet music, he called out. Makes a man want to come home, don't it? Jonah stepped out from the trees. You don't get another warning. Colton turned, grinning. I didn't come for a warning, I came for what's mine. She ain't yours. Paper says she is. That paper's trash. Everyone knows it. You think a judge'll side with you over a widow with a child and scars to prove what you did? Colton's smile faltered. You think they'll believe a mountain man over a businessman? Jonah didn't move. We don't need a court to settle this. Colton's hand twitched. Jonah saw it. The third shot never rang out. Because Jonah moved first. He fired low, deliberate. Colton dropped his rifle with a scream, clutching his shoulder, snow already dark with blood. Jonah advanced slowly, boots crunching with every step. Listen, Jonah said, voice low, even. You come near them again, I won't miss your heart. Colton's eyes burned with hate. This ain't over. It is if you stay away. There's a marshal who will be glad to hear from me. I got more friends than you think. And if I don't make it back, Miriam's got everything she needs to see justice done. Colton spat. You think she'll make it in this wild without you? She's stronger than you'll ever be. Jonah turned and walked back into the woods without another word. They reached the station that night, cold and shaken. The old friend, a wiry man named Amos, barely blinked when he saw Jonah and the woman behind him. He simply opened the door wider and pointed to the fire. You look like death, he muttered. That baby hungry. They nodded. Amos had milk, canned goods, and more blankets than seemed possible for one man to hoard. Got a wire that still works, too, he said. Just don't send too many letters. The birds get nosy. Miriam stayed quiet while Jonah wrote. The message was simple. One line. Need Marshal Rains. Urgent. Child and mother in danger. Jonah bared. They waited. Days passed. Each one quiet. Grace seemed unaware of the danger, cooing happily in her new quilt-lined crib. Jonah carved her a little wooden bird which she liked to gum between naps. Miriam sang lullabies again. Her voice came back to her slow, like a bird remembering its wings. On the fourth day, the wire sparked again. Marshall en route, 2 days hold fast. But Colton wasn't finished. That night while Jonah stood guard outside, the fire behind him flickering low, a rustle came from the edge of the trees. He turned, rifle raised. A torch lit, then another. 5 men stepped into view, faces shadowed but weapons clear. Got friends, Colton's voice called from the dark. Paid better than you did, mountain man. Jonah's heart sank. He had enough rounds for a fight, but not 5. Inside, Miriam would have heard it. He didn't look back, just whispered, Lord, give me the strength. Then a gunshot cracked from the trees, but it was Jonah's. It came from the far ridge. Another shot, then another. One of Colton's men dropped. Shouts rose. From the trees, 4 riders charged down the hill, Marshal Rains and 3 deputies, rifles blazing. The ambush crumbled like dry wood under a boot. In minutes, the attackers were disarmed, hands in the air. Colton tried to run but didn't get far. Rains himself rode him down, slammed him to the snow, and cuffed him hard enough to bruise. Jonah didn't move until it was over. Then he turned, heart racing, and ran inside. Miriam stood in the doorway, Grace in her arms. Her eyes were wide but dry. She'd heard it all. "We're safe," Jonah said. She nodded. Rains entered, glancing between them. "You all right, ma'am?" Miriam looked at Jonah, then at her daughter. "Yes," she said, "because of him." Rains nodded, gaze hard on Colton outside. "He'll never touch you again, you have my word." They took Colton that night, shackled and bloody. The deputies stayed behind for the evening just in case, but the storm had passed. And yet, a different kind of storm still lingered. Because now that the threat was gone, there was only the quiet. Only the question neither had dared ask. What now? Jonah stood outside the station at dawn, watching the mist rise over the hills. Miriam joined him, Grace asleep on her chest. "He's gone," she said softly. He nodded. She hesitated. "Do you want us to go now?" Jonah looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in a long time his voice didn't sound like gravel. "I don't want to be alone again." Miriam's breath caught. Neither of them said more. They didn't need to. The snow melted slower than usual that year, reluctant to release its grip on the land. Winter clung to the pines like a dog to a bone, and the cold seeped through even the thickest walls. But something had changed within the little outpost, something warmer than fire and steadier than shelter. It wasn't spoken aloud, not in words, but it was felt in every small motion, every shared glance. The danger had passed, but the question still hovered. Were they meant to go their separate ways, or had the fire lit in desperation found roots deeper than either had guessed? The day Marshal Rains left with his men, Miriam stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, watching the horses disappear into the trees. She didn't cry. She didn't wave. She simply watched, heart in her throat, because she knew what came next. The decision. Amos stayed quiet, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched Jonah closely that afternoon, noting the way he chopped wood like he was working out more than just chores, and the way he hovered near the cabin even when he didn't need to. Grace had taken to sitting on his lap whenever she could, tugging on his beard, cooing in his ear like they'd known each other longer than they had. And Jonah let her. More than that, he cherished it. Later that evening, with the baby asleep and the fire crackling low, Miriam stepped outside and found Jonah leaning against the porch post, staring out at the dark. "I never said thank you," she said. "You don't have to." "I do, I need to." He glanced at her, brow furrowed, but said nothing. She stepped closer. "You didn't owe me anything. You could have turned us away, told us to fend for ourselves." Jonah looked down at his boots. "Could have, but I didn't." "I know," she said, "and I've been thinking about why." He finally met her eyes. "I know why I stayed," she said, voice soft, "but I don't know why you let me." Jonah inhaled deeply. "I guess I've been alone for a long time, long enough to forget what having someone around feels like." "You still want to be alone?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the stars, then back at her. "No," he said. She nodded, "Me neither." And that was all it took. No declarations, no promises, just truth laid bare in the cold mountain air. In the weeks that followed, life took on a new rhythm. They didn't speak of what they were, only what needed to be done. Jonah built a new crib for Grace, this one with carved edges and little birds etched into the corners. Miriam planted the early seeds in Amos's small garden plot, her hands calloused but determined. They cooked together, hunted together, and sometimes sat in silence with nothing but the fire between them and the sound of Grace babbling. But it wasn't peace, not completely. Something still sat between them, unspoken. Jonah had a box under his bed. Miriam found it by accident one day looking for blankets. It was filled with letters, some unopened, others read so many times the paper had gone soft. She didn't read them. She couldn't. But that night, when Jonah came in from hauling water, she asked, "Whose are they?" He didn't flinch. He set the bucket down and sat beside her. "My brother's and his wife." Miriam waited. "They died 2 winters ago. Fever took her first. He followed not long after. Some folks said it was heartbreak. I think it was guilt. He blamed himself, said he should have gotten her help sooner." "I'm sorry," Miriam whispered. Jonah nodded. "They had a boy, my nephew. He was 7. Her heart sank. "What happened to him?" Jonah swallowed hard. "He disappeared. I left him with neighbors while I buried my brother. When I came back, they said he'd wandered off. Been looking ever since." Miriam reached out, touched his hand. "You didn't fail him." He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, "I wake up some nights thinking I hear him, laughing, calling my name, but it's always the wind." Miriam squeezed his hand. "He's still out there. You don't know that he's gone." "No," Jonah agreed, "but sometimes not knowing is worse." From that night on, something shifted between them. The air was thicker with unsaid feelings. They moved like people who'd been through war, not with each other, but side by side. Grace grew stronger by the day, her eyes following Jonah whenever he entered a room. She didn't cry when he picked her up anymore. She reached. Then one rainy evening, as Miriam was folding laundry, she dropped a small shirt, one of Grace's, and froze. Her hand went to her back, a sharp pain cutting through her side. Jonah saw her from across the room and rushed over, catching her before she could fall. "Miriam." "I'm fine," she lied, breath short. But he could see the pain in her face. He scooped her up gently, laid her on the bed, and called for Amos. The old man frowned, felt her pulse, and checked her stomach. "It's early still," he muttered. "Too early for birthing." "What is it?" Jonah demanded. "Could be a tear, could be strain. She's been pushing herself too hard. She needs to rest." Miriam gritted her teeth. "I can't just sit." "You will," Jonah said firmly. "You will, or I'll sit on you myself." That earned a weak laugh, but she agreed. For the next few days she stayed in bed and Jonah took over everything. Cooking, cleaning, even feeding Grace. And Miriam watched, something in her heart slowly breaking open. He wasn't just a man who saved them. He was becoming a father. And that terrified her. One night, as he sat at the edge of the bed, bottle in hand, feeding Grace, Miriam spoke. "You'd make a good father." Jonah didn't look up. "I ain't sure I ever deserved that title." "But you want it." His eyes met hers, more than anything. She swallowed. "What if I'm not enough?" "You are," he said instantly. "I'm scared." "So am I." They sat in that silence, watching Grace's tiny hands curl around Jonah's finger. Then he whispered, "But maybe we can be scared together." A week passed, then 2. Spring crept in, timid and soft. The snow gave way to mud and buds, and the woods whispered of life again. Miriam's strength returned slowly. She moved more each day, her belly heavy with the child to come. Grace began to walk, wobbly steps that sent Jonah into nervous fits every time she let go of furniture. One afternoon, Jonah returned from checking the traps and found Miriam outside, standing at the edge of the woods. He approached quiet. "You all right?" She didn't answer, she just pointed. A small figure stood beyond the tree line, dirty, thin, holding something in his arms. Jonah stepped forward slowly. "Hello," he called. The boy didn't move. Then he took one step forward and whispered something. Jonah's heart stopped. His name. Uncle Jonah. Miriam gasped. Jonah dropped to his knees. "No, it can't be." The boy ran to him, and Jonah caught him midair, wrapping him in arms that shook. "It's me," the boy cried. "I found you." Jonah held him tight, face buried in the boy's hair, tears falling fast. "I thought I lost you," he choked out. "I thought you were gone." "I followed the birds," the boy whispered. "They told me to keep walking." Miriam knelt beside them, tears in her eyes too. Grace toddled forward, watching curiously. Jonah looked at Miriam, then back at his nephew. "Your name," he said, voice shaking. "Say it again." The boy smiled, gap-toothed. "My name's Luke." And just like that, the last piece of Jonah's broken heart was restored. But as they turned back to the cabin, Jonah's arms full with the boy he thought he'd lost, a shadow passed over the treetops. Not all stories end when the family is whole. Sometimes it's just the calm before the next storm. The cabin pulsed with a kind of hush that hadn't been there before, as if the walls themselves knew they were now holding something sacred, something mended, yet fragile. Luke's return did not bring a raucous celebration, but something deeper, reverence. The kind of quiet joy that settles in your bones and doesn't need song or clamor to declare its presence. Jonah hadn't let the boy out of his sight since he'd come out of the trees, arms full of a ragged old blanket and a little tin box clutched to his chest. No one asked how he survived. Not yet. Not when the truth might splinter the miracle with something colder than what they were willing to face. Amos didn't press either. He watched the boy with cautious eyes, moving slower around him, measuring the way he clung to Jonah and how quickly he shrank from sudden movement or loud sounds. Grace, however, had no such reservations. She followed him like a shadow, tugging at his sleeve, offering him small treasures like pinecones and pebbles with a wide smile and trusting gaze. And slowly Luke began to accept them, began to let her in. Miriam watched it unfold with a heart that ached. She saw the weight Jonah carried now, the joy twisted with guilt, the protectiveness hard as granite, and the weariness of a man who hadn't dared hope in so long. She wanted to reach out, say something to lighten the burden, but her own body was reminding her each day that life was coming, fast and without pause. Her pregnancy had advanced further than she'd been ready to admit. Though her due date was still weeks away, her body had started showing signs that it wouldn't wait that long. The pains came at night, low and deep, and she didn't tell Jonah. Not yet. Not when Luke had only just returned. Not when the house had finally settled into something close to peace. But peace has a way of drawing the storm. 3 days after Luke's return, they heard the horse hooves. Distant at first, just a shiver in the earth, but Amos stiffened as he felt them. He was outside skinning a rabbit when the vibration rolled under his boots, and by the time Jonah stepped out to ask him something, the old man's eyes were already narrowed on the horizon. "Riders," Amos said simply. Jonah tensed. "You sure?" "Too many for mail, too slow for hunters. Somebody's coming with purpose." Jonah didn't hesitate. He handed Grace off to Miriam and told Luke to stay inside. Then he saddled his rifle and loaded shells into his belt one by one, eyes like flint. Miriam stood in the doorway. "You think it's the men from the saloon?" "Could be," Jonah said, tying off his holster. "Could be someone worse." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. The riders appeared near dusk, 6 of them, dressed not in black like the ones before, but in worn coats and dust-covered hats, eyes half hidden and expressions unreadable. They stopped 100 yards from the cabin, dismounted, and one of them raised his hand. "Name's Harlan Rusk," he called out, voice carrying low and gravel thick. "I ain't here to start nothing. I'm looking for my nephew." Jonah froze. Miriam stepped closer, whispering, "Your brother's wife was her family from Rusk's territory." He nodded slowly. "They didn't approve of the marriage, disowned her. Far as I knew, they'd never even met Luke." "Well," Amos muttered from behind him, "looks like they changed their mind." Jonah stepped forward, gun slung but not drawn. "What do you want with the boy?" Rusk took off his hat. His face was scarred, weathered, and held a kind of sadness Jonah recognized immediately. "Didn't know he was alive," Rusk said. "Not until a rider passed through Iron Rock and said a boy was found wanderin' the pass, mutterin' about birds and an Uncle Jonah." He paused. "Had my sister's eyes, that boy. I rode hard just to see if it was true." Jonah hesitated, then motioned for the man to stay put. He turned and called over his shoulder, "Luke, come here, son." The door creaked open. Luke appeared, hand in Miriam's, eyes wide. He stepped forward slowly, unsure. Rusk's expression cracked. "Lord above, it's really you." Luke didn't move. Jonah crouched beside him. "Do you know this man?" Luke shook his head. Rusk's voice faltered. "I'm your kin, boy, your mama's brother." Luke's grip on Jonah's sleeve tightened. "I want to stay here." Jonah stood, chest swelling with the conflict he hadn't expected so soon. "He's been through a lot," he said. "This ain't the time to pull him into more confusion." Rusk nodded. "I ain't here to take him, Jonah. Not if you don't want to go. I just wanted to see him, know he's all right." Jonah studied him. "Then come in, eat, warm yourself. Let the boy decide in time." The tension dropped, just enough for them all to breathe. That night, Harlan sat by the fire, telling Luke stories of his mother when she was young, how she used to sneak sugar cubes from the storehouse and let her pony sleep inside the kitchen when no one was looking. Luke laughed, eyes sparkling in a way that made Miriam ache with gratitude and sorrow at once. Jonah sat on the edge of the room, watching, never far from the rifle. Later that night, when the guests had gone to sleep in the barn and the fire had burned low, Miriam clutched her stomach with a sharp cry. Jonah was at her side in seconds. "What is it?" She couldn't answer. The pain came again, stronger. Amos appeared in the doorway, already pulling on his coat. "It's time." "No," Miriam gasped. "It's early." "Early or not," Amos said, his voice steel, "that child's coming now." Jonah looked stricken. "What do I do?" "Boil water, blankets, stay close." The hours that followed were chaos and pain, sweat and prayer. Miriam cried out, teeth clenched, hands gripping Jonah's like a lifeline. He held her, whispered to her, wiped her brow, whispered every promise he could think of. Grace cried in the corner until Luke picked her up and held her close, rocking her gently. Amos worked with the precision of a man who had seen more births than battles, but even he looked troubled as the hours dragged on. The baby wasn't turning right. Miriam was weakening. The firelight flickered low, casting shadows like ghosts along the walls. Finally, with a cry that tore through the mountain silence, the baby came. A girl. Small, too small. She didn't cry at first. Jonah's heart stopped. But then a gasp, a wail, a furious little sound that shattered the silence. He sobbed, cradling Miriam, who lay limp but breathing. Amos handed him the child, wrapped in flannel, eyes shut tight but pink and alive. "She's here," Jonah whispered. "She's really here." Miriam stirred, cracked a weak smile. "Let me see her." He placed the baby in her arms, and the look on her face, exhausted, tear-streaked but radiant, was something Jonah would remember till his last breath. "What will we name her?" he asked. Miriam didn't hesitate. "Hope." Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft, gentle flakes that whispered against the roof like a lullaby. And inside that cabin, with one baby sleeping, another finally breathing, and a family pieced together by pain and grace, Jonah finally understood what it meant to not be alone. But dawn would bring another knock at the door, another face from the past, another truth. And this one would be hers. The morning light had barely pushed its way through the narrow windows when a firm knock landed on the door, not with the wild desperation of the night Jonah brought Luke home, nor the distant civility Harlan Rusk carried with him. This knock was different, steady, heavy, intentional, like whoever stood on the other side wasn't waiting to be invited in, but rather giving the cabin a chance to prepare for whatever wait came next. Inside, the cabin was quiet, almost reverently so. The newborn Hope slept curled against Miriam's chest, her tiny breaths barely noticeable except for the rise and fall of the blanket wrapped around her. Jonah hadn't slept. He hadn't even closed his eyes. He sat in the rocker beside the bed, gun laid across his lap, every sense awake and taut. He didn't yet understand what they had survived last night. He only knew it had changed something in him, reshaped him in a way he hadn't expected, softened the hard lines he'd thought were permanent. But that knock, that was the sound of something unfinished. He stood carefully, brushing a kiss against Miriam's forehead. She didn't wake, just exhaled softly and curled tighter around the baby. Grace stirred at the noise, rubbing her eyes, and Luke, already up and fully dressed, silently reached for her hand. The boy hadn't spoken much since the birth. He'd watched it with a quiet awe and afterwards sat with his chin resting on his knees in the corner, eyes filled with something older than his years. Jonah stepped toward the door, glancing once at Amos, who had taken the old rocking chair nearest the fireplace. The old man met his look with a slight nod and a reach for the knife at his belt. Jonah opened the door. A woman stood there. She wasn't young, but neither was she old. Her eyes were sharp as flint and ringed with lines that told of long roads traveled and harder truths weathered. She wore a dark blue riding coat cinched at the waist, a pistol on her hip, and gloves too thin for the cold but still buttoned all the way up. Her boots were scuffed, and her cheeks red from the wind. But it wasn't the clothes or the way she stood that made Jonah's gut tighten. It was her eyes. They flicked past him into the room, and then landed on him with a steadiness that made the back of his neck go stiff. "I'm looking for Miriam Dorsey," she said. Jonah didn't move. "Why?" "I believe she has something that belongs to me." Jonah's hand slid toward the doorframe, where his rifle leaned. The woman raised her palm slowly. "Easy. I'm not here to cause harm, but if she's the woman I think she is, then we have unfinished business." Amos stood now too, stepping into view. "You want to explain what kind of business you're talking about, ma'am?" The woman gave a small, unreadable smile. "I suppose that depends on whether she tells the truth." From behind, a weak voice cut through the tension. "Let her in." Jonah turned. Miriam stood in the hallway, one hand on the wall for balance, the baby still in her arms. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "She won't hurt anyone." Jonah stepped aside reluctantly. The woman entered slowly, looking at the baby first, then at the others. She took off her gloves and tucked them into her belt. Her hands were calloused, fingers long, nails clean. "You named her Hope," the woman said softly, then looked back at Miriam. "Fitting." Miriam nodded. "She nearly died last night, but she didn't." The woman's face twitched. "Neither did you." Amos stepped between them. "Who are you?" The woman looked at Jonah, then at Miriam again. "Tell them." Miriam closed her eyes. "Her name is Karen. She was married to my husband." The room froze. Not even the fire popped. Amos muttered under his breath and sat down hard. Jonah, stunned, felt the bottom fall out of everything. "What?" he finally managed. Miriam looked at him, guilt streaking her face. "It wasn't what you think. I didn't know about her until after. He married her years before me. Back east. I never saw a certificate, never heard her name until she found me." Karen crossed her arms. "He told me she was dead." "And he told me you were." Jonah stared at them both. "You're saying the man you married was married to both of you?" Miriam nodded. Karen added, "And to a third if my guess is right." Jonah leaned against the table. His breath felt short. "So that makes the baby." "Mine," Miriam whispered, "but raised under a lie. I didn't know who he was, not really. Not until after Luke was born and the letters started arriving." Karen's jaw tensed. "You know what he was, Jonah." "I know he was no good," Jonah said. "No, worse. He was a smuggler. Ran a ring that trafficked people through mining towns out west. Said he had worked for them, took their money, left them to die in the cliffs." Luke, listening silently, pressed closer to Grace. "He used each of us," Karen continued, voice shaking. "Left me in Kentucky pregnant and alone, took everything, disappeared. I tracked him as far as Missouri before I found out about Miriam. Then I stopped. Thought maybe she'd made him honest. Then I found out about the fire, the boy, the money he took from those men in Timber Rock." Miriam covered her mouth. Karen's eyes softened. "I'm not here to hurt you. I came because I heard what you did. How you saved the boy, how you left everything behind. I needed to see it. Needed to know if you were who he said you were." Jonah's throat burned. "And what did he say?" "That she was good," Karen said simply. "That she deserved better than him." Miriam sat down slowly, her body still weak from labor. "Why now?" Karen looked down at the baby again. "Because this is the first time I ever saw someone live through what I didn't. You escaped him. I didn't. I wanted to see the woman who survived." Jonah knelt beside Miriam. "And now?" "I go," Karen said, "but not before I give you this." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather satchel. She placed it on the table and stepped back. "It's his, everything he ever wrote. The names, the money trails, the partners. If any of the people he hurt are still alive, they'll want justice. I figure it starts with you." Miriam reached out with a trembling hand and touched the bag. It felt like holding a ghost. Karen looked at the baby one last time, nodded, then turned toward the door. "You won't stay?" Jonah asked. "I've done my part," she replied. "The rest is yours." And just like that, she was gone. They stood in silence for a long time after, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. That night, after the children were asleep and the baby fed, Jonah sat beside Miriam on the bed. She held the satchel on her lap, unopened. "You gonna read it?" he asked. "Eventually," she whispered. He took her hand. "You're not her, you're not him, you're you, and I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." Tears spilled quietly down her face. "I didn't want you to find out like that." "I'm glad I found out at all," he said. "Now I know what we're fighting against." She leaned into him. "You still want us?" "I never stopped." And in the quiet cabin with the fire burning low, they made a vow without speaking. One forged not in a church or before witnesses, but in fire, blood, and the kind of forgiveness that only love can birth. But they weren't out of the woods. Because 3 days later, a telegram arrived from Timber Rock. The sheriff was dead. The outlaw crew had taken the town. And Luke's name was on a list they carried. The wind had changed. Jonah felt it before he saw anything, before the message was even read aloud. He'd been chopping wood out back, his flannel shirt soaked through with sweat despite the bitter air, when the mule arrived in a full-body lather, sides heaving like it, run for its life. The rider, a boy not older than 12, slid from the saddle, breathless and pale as snow. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just handed over the folded telegram and took off again without a word, the mule barely catching its wind before being urged on once more. Jonah didn't need to open it to know it wasn't good. The paper smelled like soot. The boy's face had said more than ink could. But he opened it anyway, standing alone beneath the pines as he read the words that would rearrange everything they had managed to rebuild. Sheriff Holloway dead, Timber Rock fallen, outlaws in control, searching for the Dorsey boy. His grip on the telegram tightened until it crumpled. He knew the men behind it. Not just by name, but by the way they moved, the way they talked, the way they shot. They weren't strangers. They were men Jonah once rode with. Back before the mountain swallowed him, before the guilt changed his name, before Miriam. And if they were hunting Luke, it meant something far worse than what the words on that telegram could contain. It meant they were unraveling the lie that had kept this family safe. He strode into the cabin, his boots like thunder across the floorboards. Miriam was rocking Hope, humming softly under her breath. She looked up at the sound of his approach, her face still lined with exhaustion but glowing with a serenity she'd earned. Jonah handed her the telegram. Her hands shook as she read. "They know," she whispered. "They know," Jonah repeated. Luke, who had been helping Amos peel apples at the table, looked up sharply. "What do they want with me?" Amos exchanged a glance with Jonah, but didn't answer. Miriam stood slowly. "You said you de-burned all the papers, the records, the money trail." "I did," Jonah said, "but some things don't stay buried." Luke moved closer to Miriam, his young face shadowed by something deeper than fear. "Is this about him, my father?" Neither adult answered right away. Finally Amos spoke, voice low and raspy. "It ain't about who he was, boy. It's about what he left behind, you." The room went still. Luke blinked slowly. "I don't want anything from him." "Don't matter," Jonah said. "They do." Amos pushed back from the table and stood. "We'll have to move fast. They ain't just looking. They're sweeping, town by town." Miriam clutched the baby tighter. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," Jonah said. "Not until they get what they think is owed." Amos scratched at his beard. "You got 3 choices, run, hide, or fight." "I'm not running," Miriam said firmly, her voice steady even if her knees were. "Not again." Jonah looked at her. "Then we fight." That night under a moonless sky, Jonah saddled the horses while Amos laid out the weapons. A single rifle, a shotgun, 2 revolvers, and a collection of knives. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, But Jonah had something those men didn't. He had nothing left to lose. And he had the mountain. The plan wasn't to storm Timber Rock. That would have been suicide. The plan was simpler, dirtier, smarter. They'd lure them into the wild, into territory they didn't know, into traps Amos had been setting in those hills since before Jonah had even grown a beard. Luke wanted to come. He stood beside the saddle, fists clenched, jaw set. "I can help," he said. "I know how to shoot." Jonah crouched in front of him, hands on his shoulders. "You're 13. "I was 12 last week," Luke said. "That ain't better." "I still remember the fire," Luke said softly. "I remember him yelling. I remember her crying. I remember dragging Grace out through the window while the floor burned." Jonah looked into his eyes and saw a fire that hadn't gone out in years. "You'll stay with Miriam," Jonah said, then added, "You're the reason we're fighting, not the soldier." The boy didn't answer. He just nodded once and walked back into the cabin. By morning, Jonah and Amos were gone. They didn't ride straight into Timber Rock. Instead, they circled north, following the river fork that led into the cliffs. From there, they doubled back through the pine thickets where the wind howled like wolves and visibility dropped to feet. The outlaws would expect a direct confrontation. They'd never expect ghosts from the mountain. 2 nights in, they made camp near the Devil's Notch, a narrow gully that split into 4 deer trails, each leading to a dead end. Amos set traps at every entrance. Jonah spread soot across the ground to disguise movement. By dawn, the first scout appeared. Jonah saw him before the man knew he was being watched. Dressed in a leather duster, a long rifle slung across his back. He paused at the top of the ridge, scanning the forest like a man trying to remember a dream he'd had a long time ago. Jonah waited until he passed beneath a low branch and then dropped. He didn't kill him, just knocked him out cold and dragged him behind the rocks. They tied him there, gagged, and left a note pinned to his chest. "Go home. You've entered the wrong man's woods." By the 3rd day, there were 10 of them. But Jonah knew these woods better than they did. He knew how the wind turned a whisper into a howl. He knew where the river ran fastest beneath a frozen crust. He knew where the cliff edges would break under weight. One by one they fell, not to bullets, to the mountain. By day 5, 3 men remained. And one of them was Boone Garver. The name hadn't been spoken in Jonah's mouth for near a decade, but he'd never forgotten it. Not after what Boone did in Dry Creek. Not after the girl who cried for 3 days straight. Boone didn't steal for gain. He stole for sport. And now he had Miriam's name in his hands. Jonah met him alone. No guns, no blades. Just a single lantern hanging from a crooked tree branch, and a voice that hadn't aged a day. "Well, well," Boone said, stepping into the clearing, his eyes flickering with recognition. "Ain't you a ghost?" Jonah didn't smile. "You shouldn't have come here." Boone spread his arms. "You think I came for the boy? That was just bait. I came for you." "I buried you," Jonah said. "You tried," Boone grinned, "but you always did underestimate me." Jonah stepped forward. "You remember the girl in Dry Creek?" Boone's eyes hardened. "She was a liar. She was 13. She was in my way." Jonah didn't say another word. He lunged. The fight wasn't pretty. It wasn't choreographed. It was raw, brutal. 2 men who once rode under the same sky, now dragging each other through dirt and ice, breaking bones and spitting blood. Boone fought like a cornered animal. Jonah fought like a man with a family. When it ended, Jonah stood bleeding from his side, gasping for breath, his boot pressed against Boone's neck. "You'll never find the boy," Jonah said. Boone gurgled something incoherent. "You'll never touch her again." And with a final shove, Jonah stepped back. Boone's body slid into the ravine, vanishing into darkness. When Jonah returned to the cabin 3 days later, Miriam was waiting on the porch, Hope in her arms, Luke and Grace asleep beside her. She ran to him. He collapsed into her arms, half conscious, and she held him there until the tears came. Tears from him. The next day, Amos buried the satchel of papers beneath the oak tree, beside the first sprigs of spring wildflowers. A silent grave for a past that wouldn't return. Luke sat by the fire with Grace, holding her hand, telling her the story of the first time he ever saw snow fall from the mountain. And Jonah, stitched and bruised, held Hope against his chest and whispered promises no one else could hear. They had survived again. But the mountain wasn't done. Because someone else had read that telegram too. And he was on his way. He startled awake, rubbing at his face. "I told you I'd come. I thought I dreamed you." "You didn't," he said. "You don't get to leave yet, not till I tell you something." Her eyes met his, soft but tired. "What?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "Doctor had it waiting," he said, "at the post station, said it came with no return address." Miriam frowned as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the lines, then scanned them again. She didn't speak for a long while. "Who?" Jonah asked gently. She looked up at him. "My sister." Jonah's brow furrowed. "You never said you had one." "I didn't know if she was still alive." "What's it say?" Miriam read aloud, her voice thin but steady. "If you're reading this, then the winds finally carried you my way. I've waited years, Miri. I never stopped looking. I'm in cold birch now. Come, if you're safe, come." Jonah watched her as she folded the letter. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Miriam's eyes flicked to her children, then to him. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Are you coming with me?" He blinked. "You want me to?" "I don't want to do this life without you," she said softly. "Not anymore." Jonah felt something shift in his chest, like a door he'd kept locked for too long had just creaked open. He nodded. "Then I'll pack the wagon." The next few weeks were a blur of motion. The doctor stayed long enough to see everyone stable, then accepted Amos's mule and a month's worth of dried meat as payment. Before he left, he handed Jonah a small tin box. "For the road," he said, "and for Hope." Miriam began gathering what few belongings they had. Luke helped Grace pack her doll, while Hope gurgled in her cradle, healthier now than she'd ever been. Amos, after some persuasion, agreed to come with them. "I've lived in these woods long enough," he said. "Time to see what the world looks like down the other side." They left just as spring tipped into summer. The garden was left behind, as was the trapline, the porch swing, the grave marker behind the house carved with nothing but the initials BG. They traveled for weeks. Through valley and plain. Through townships and railways. Until finally one morning they crested a hill and saw cold birch stretched below them. A small town wrapped in fences and flower beds, with church bells echoing in the distance. And at the edge of town stood a woman in a yellow dress, waving with both hands, tears already in her eyes. Miriam clutched Jonah's hand. She waited, she whispered. Some people always do, Jonah said. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But in Miriam's heart, something unspoken finally settled. She had come to the mountain with nothing. Now she left it with everything. A new life. A family that had chosen each other through fire and sickness. And a man who had once buried his name, now ready to say it aloud again. When the wagon reached the gate, the woman in yellow stepped forward. And Miriam finally let go of the last of her fear. Because she knew she was home. And this time she wasn't alone.